What happens when a sovereign nation just has enough, fed up with corruption, feeling pressured geopolitically, and decides its critical energy lifeline is just too vital to leave in the hands of a foreign company tied to an adversary?
Well, that's exactly what seems to be unfolding right now in Bulgaria. It's quite dramatic, actually. A NATO member right on the eastern edge.
And they're actively trying to reclaim some economic control, aren't they? Through some pretty forceful legal steps.
Absolutely. And it looks like this is being driven almost entirely by external pressure, specifically financial pressure from the United States.
Okay, so that's the core of our deep dive today. We're looking at this extraordinary situation where the Bulgarian government is pushing legislation to, well, effectively seize and sell its biggest oil refinery, its only oil refinery, Lukoil Neftohim Burgas.
Yeah, and this isn't, just a normal corporate sale. It feels much more like a strategic break, a way for Bulgaria to distance itself from Russia's economic influence.
And the trigger was pretty clear.
Oh, absolutely. It seems to be these very aggressive U.S. sanctions that came down in late October 2025. They hit major Russian oil players, hard Lukoil, Rosneft.
Right.
And crucially, it wasn't just about freezing assets in the U.S. They carried this threat of severe secondary penalties. That means any company, anywhere, even allies in Europe, could face serious consequences if they kept doing business with these sanctioned Russian firms.
Wow. So if you're Bulgaria and this one refinery, Burgas, supplies, what is it, over two-thirds of your fuel.
That's right. More than two-thirds.
Then you're suddenly facing a potential national crisis, aren't you? Keep Lukoil running the show and boom, U.S. sanctions could effectively shut down your fuel supply.
Exactly. And we already saw signs of panic, didn't we? Bulgaria actually suspended exports of diesel and aviation fuel.
Even to its EU partners.
Even to EU partners, because they were afraid, really afraid of imminent shortages at home.
So in a way, it feels like the U.S. is kind of forcing an ally to, well, clean house. Using sanctions as leverage.
You could certainly see it that way. It's like Bulgaria is using the justification of this global sanctions regime to finally tackle some really deep-seated domestic problems they've had for decades. Problems tied directly to relying on Russian energy.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to really trace how this powerful U.S. economic pressure is forcing, well, what looks like a huge retreat of Russian energy assets globally. And also to look at the tricky legal steps allies are taking to secure their own energy future and, demand some accountability. So let's zoom in a bit on that refinery, on Burgas. Why did this relationship with Lukoil become so difficult? I mean, beyond the obvious risk of relying on a Russian firm right there on NATO's border.
Well, local reports and critics paint a pretty damning picture. It wasn't just about geopolitical risk. It was about alleged behavior that many saw as, frankly, predatory, exploiting Bulgaria's national interests.
Oh, so?
Well, the big one often cited is this alleged financial dodging. It's pretty staggering if the reports are accurate. Lukoil, the owner, apparently reported income of, get this, $4.67 billion in 2024. Billions flowing through.
Okay, $4.67 billion. That's enormous income. So what did they end up paying in taxes?
Well, this is the shocking part, according to those local sources. The company apparently managed its books to show a net loss of just $109,000 for that same year.
A loss. On nearly $4.7 billion in revenue. How is that even possible?
Critics argue it's a deliberate strategy, structure things so that, on paper, there's almost no profit generated in Bulgaria, which means almost zero tax paid to the Bulgarian government. The value gets extracted elsewhere.
That alone sounds like grounds for a strong reaction trying to protect national revenue. But you mentioned other things too, environmental issues.
Yeah, the sources also detail some really serious environmental concerns. Critics accuse the refinery of causing massive ecological damage.
Like what?
Things like allegedly dumping huge amounts of oil waste directly into Lake Via, which is apparently destroying Bulgaria's largest lake.
That's terrible.
It is. And then there's the air pollution issue. Allegations that they frequently release toxic fumes late at night. Sources mention specifically between 3 and 4 a.m.
Why then?
Because, allegedly, it's cheaper to just burn off waste using these huge torches than it is to invest the millions needed for proper, modern, compliant ecological controls. It fits a pattern, critics say, of a foreign company exploiting the host country for profit with little regard for the consequences.
Okay, so you've got the financial angle, the environmental damage, and the geopolitical risk. Suddenly, this legislative plan to seize the refinery, it doesn't sound so extreme. It sounds more like national self-defense.
Exactly. And the proposed laws seem designed for speed and finality. allow the government to seize it, put an external administrator in charge of selling it, and this is key strip Lukoil of its voting rights and its power to fight the decision in court.
They're basically saying national security and accountability trump the property rights of this particular foreign entity.
And that speed is critical, isn't it? They can't afford to get bogged down in years of legal battles while their main fuel source is under this constant threat from sanctions.
Right. That point where national necessity kind of overrides standard business law. That's where things get really interesting. So let's pivot slightly and look at those U.S. sanctions themselves, the ones from late October 2025. What were the immediate ripple effects?
Well, the impact was fast and pretty dramatic. It really shows the power of targeted economic pressure when used as a foreign policy weapon.
How so?
As soon as the U.S. mentioned those secondary penalties, Lukoil basically signaled defeat. They announced they plan to sell off their international assets globally. The reports called it an unprecedented forced retreat. That's not voluntary restructuring that's being forced out by sanctions.
And you could see this in the actual oil market data.
Oh, definitely. Russia's seaborne crude shipments took a sharp dive in early November, apparently the largest weekly drop since way back in January 2024.
But wait, why would an American sanction make buyers in, say, Asia suddenly stop buying Russian oil?
Because the ultimate weapon here is access to the U.S. dollar system. The global financial system runs on dollars.
Right.
Losing access to dollar banking is like cutting off oxygen for a major international trader. The risk of getting caught up in secondary sanctions just became too high overnight. So Asian buyers paused, reassessed. It wasn't worth the potential disruption to their entire business.
So it's not just about punishing Russia, it's actually reshaping the global energy market.
Precisely. It's a strategic reallocation of market share and profits. While Russia's output and revenues stumbled,
Western oil companies did okay.
more than okay. We saw reports that refining profits for the big players, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, Total Energies, jumped something like 61% in the third quarter compared to the previous one. That helped boost their overall earnings by about 20%.
Wow. So the sanctions achieved two things at once.
Seems like it. They squeeze Russia's income, which is the primary goal, right?
Yeah.
But they also simultaneously boost the profits and market position of Western allied energy firms. It looks like strategic financial warfare playing out exactly as designed.
Okay, so Bulgaria seizing a corporate asset like the Lukoil refinery, that's one level of accountability. But the bigger discussion in the West, the much bigger prize, really, is about seizing frozen Russian sovereign assets, things like central bank reserves.
Yes, exactly. Billions held in Western banks.
And the goal there is to use that money to fund Ukraine's reconstruction, which is going to cost an astronomical amount. But this is where things get legally very complicated, right?
Extremely complicated. This is where you run smack into a fundamental principle of international law, state immunity.
Okay, break that down for us.
Basically, international law generally protects states, and especially their central banks, which get even stronger protection from having their property seized by the courts of another country. Imagine if a court in, say, London could just order the Bank of France's assets seized. It would be chaos.
Right. It stops countries from constantly suing each other and seizing assets through domestic courts.
Exactly. It's designed to maintain order and respect for sovereignty. So enforcing judgments against state property is usually prohibited unless there are very specific, narrow exceptions.
So if the courts can't legally touch these frozen billions belonging to the Russian central bank, how does the West make Russia pay for the damage caused in Ukraine? That money seems essential for rebuilding.
Well, this is where the legal minds get creative and where we see this critical workaround. The key distinction they're making is that state immunity generally applies to judicial actions, things ordered by a judge or a court.
Okay.
It doesn't typically restrict the powers of the executive branch or the legislative branch when they're conducting foreign policy.
So Congress or Parliament can potentially do what a judge cannot.
That's the argument, precisely. So when the U.S. Congress talks about something like the RPO Act, that's the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act, they're essentially trying to give the president, the executive branch, the specific legal authority to confiscate those sovereign assets.
So it bypasses the courts and the state immunity issue associated with them.
It aims to, yes. It frames it as a political decision, an act of foreign policy by the state itself, rather than a judicial enforcement action. Canada has already taken similar steps. The idea is that the law of state immunity wasn't really designed to shield a state from facing consequences for major international wrongs like aggression, especially when imposed by the political branches of another government.
Right. The original purpose was more about predictable relations, not providing a shield for, well, massive violations. So using legislation seems like the pathway being pursued.
It appears to be the clearest path forward if the goal is to actually repurpose those frozen funds for Ukraine. It's about political will finding a legal mechanism.
Okay, let's bring this back to Bulgaria. Their move to seize the refinery, it fits into a much bigger picture, doesn't it? It's part of this broader push, especially in Eastern Europe, to cut ties with Russia and secure energy independence.
Absolutely. You see it across the board. Bulgaria actually stopped importing all Russian crude oil back in March 2024. That was a huge step.
And it's not just oil, is it? They're diversifying elsewhere, too.
Definitely. Look, their nuclear power. They've got the Kozloduy plant. They started switching fuel for one of the units from Russian suppliers to Westinghouse, the American company, in mid-2024.
Okay.
And they're planning to build 2 new reactors at Kozloduy, also using Westinghouse technology, the AP1000. And critically, they explicitly excluded Russian companies from even bidding on that project. That's a very clear strategic pivot westward.
That is a major shift. And they're building infrastructure, too, right, to connect with neighbors.
Yes, improving connectivity is key. They finished the interconnector pipeline with Greece, the IGB, which lets them bring in non-Russian gas, and they're building another one towards Serbia, the IBS. It's all about creating options, reducing dependence on that single eastern source.
So all these moves, seizing the refinery, switching nuclear fuel, building pipelines, it all points towards securing their own future.
And it connects back to that broader need for accountability you mentioned. Ukraine's reconstruction needs are just immense. The World Bank and others estimated the total cost at around US $411 billion.
$411 billion. It's hard to even comprehend.
It is. And just for the energy sector alone, rebuilding power plants, grids, pipelines, the estimate was around $47 billion needed. So when you see actions like Bulgaria seizing corporate assets or the West debating seizing sovereign assets, it's happening against the backdrop of this enormous damage that needs repairing. The actions seem proportionate to the injury suffered.
Okay, so wrapping this up then, this deep dive into Bulgaria's really decisive action with the Lukoil refinery, it really highlights a few key things, doesn't it?
I think so.
First, how potent U.S. sanctions can be in actually reshaping the geopolitical landscape, forcing even huge companies like Lukoil into what you called a forced retreat.
Yes, the economic leverage is undeniable.
And second, it shines a light on this complex, maybe necessary, use of executive or legislative power by nations to essentially cut ties with entities linked to hostile states, especially when critical infrastructure is involved.
Right. It highlights that tension between traditional international law, like state immunity or property rights, and the immediate needs of national security and political accountability in a crisis. Bulgaria clearly decided where its priorities lie.
They prioritize their energy security, getting rid of perceived corruption, and maybe restoring some environmental damage over the property rights of a foreign company tied to an adversary.
It's a powerful statement about national sovereignty asserting itself.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If these U.S. sanctions, just by being announced, could lead to Western energy companies seeing a massive 61% jump in refining profits and push a giant like Lukoil to effectively abandon the global stage, you have to wonder how much more pressure, how many more of these assertive executive or legislative actions will it take before Moscow truly faces accountability for that staggering $411 billion bill?